Welcome to the show Brain Rot, What Our Screens Are Doing to Our Minds, a special series from the New Books Network. Here are your hosts, Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Harry Gill.
Welcome to Brain Rot. Brain rot, incidentally, was the Oxford 2024 Word of the Year. It means the deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, and particularly as a result of overconsumption of trivial or unchallenging material, especially online content. And it captures the essence of this new podcast special series that is sponsored by the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Karyne Messina, a psychologist, psychoanalyst, author, and podcast host on the New Books Network, where I conduct interviews with authors of new books on psychology, mental illness, climate change, and many other topics. Dr. Gill and I are writing one book for professionals and academics and another one for parents, the public, and for people who are afflicted with this condition of watching too much screen time. One is how screen time affects our brains and our minds from a neuroscience and psychoanalytic perspective. The second one is the genie in the box, the unfortunate ways our brains coexist with screens. And as I said, that's for the general public. We'll let you know when those will be out. So I'm doing this podcast with Dr. Erik Erikson, a renowned psychiatrist who also has a PhD in neuroscience. In his 2 decades of clinical practice, he has been a medical director of behavioral health services in a number of hospitals around the DC metropolitan area. Dr. Gill has directly overseen the treatment of hundreds of patients whose psychiatric conditions range from mild to life-threatening. During that time, he has witnessed what we're going to be talking about, a constant barrage of digital information that erodes genuine connections with other people. And of course, that leads to isolation and despair. It is of interest to note that Dr. Gill grew up in Croatia. And when he was growing up, there were 3 state-run television stations. But instead of watching them, he and his father found out what was going on around the world by listening to shortwave radio, which I think is really fascinating. So limited his exposure to technology, and instead he was able to develop a deep appreciation for critical thinking. Today, Dr. Gill is board-certified psychiatrist and assistant clinical professor at George Washington University. He is also president of HGMD, a clinical private psychiatric practice in New York and Pennsylvania. He also serves as medical director of Embark in Cabot John, Maryland. This is an innovative program that provides mental health services to adolescents and young adults. I believe that the participants range from ages 13 to 22. Dr. Gill's interaction with hundreds of young individuals grappling with the fallout of digital immersion has provided him with gut-wrenching insights into the destructive nature of uncurated screen time and social media exposure. So, on to our discussion. In this series, we will discuss one of the single greatest problems we see our children, adolescent, and adult patients have to contend with these days. And we're not just talking about kids. Older people have this issue as well. And it's the experience of being exposed to way too much screen time. We're bombarded with constant stimulation, while at the same time we are more distant and isolated from one another. And on that note, community is so important, but you really You might think you have an online community of 500 friends, but you don't really have 500 friends. You may have 500 followers, you may have 5 million followers, but they aren't friends, as in the real sense of friendship and people who you care about, who care about you. And so the screen time cuts down on that. Misinformation is also spreading at a rapid pace while social structures are breaking down across the globe. So that's also a problem. So we'll be getting into all these issues, and we hope that we can provide information that will help limit screen time for your family and for yourselves. We'll talk about the problem from a neuroscience and from a psychoanalytic perspective, focusing on Erik Erikson's 8 stages of development. So, Dr. Gill, why don't you give us an oversight of the problem from your perspective?
First, thank you for your introduction, and it's a pleasure to talk to you. We talk a lot as friends and professional peers. The idea for the book really started, as you mentioned, in the course of working with teenagers, young adults, and families, and observing the struggles that they're experiencing with screens. The span of my career is interesting because it predates the advent of iPhone, which was the original screen that in many ways changed the world, giving us a touch screen connection with the universe, so to speak. And to see the progression and slow invasion of screens into our life has been both fascinating and terrifying. And by corollary, what you mentioned, I want to amplify the disintegration of the social fabric in which people are interacting with screens, even with their friends, as a tool of connection. So the totality of the connectedness between people that involves observing each other's eye to eye and smelling each other and being able to touch each other has slowly disappeared. The other phenomena has been 2 years of isolation in COVID that has really, really promoted in a rapid pace the effects of social isolation on young developing minds. And as you mentioned, I see hundreds of teenagers over the years, and that was the impetus for this conversation and for this book, is to basically share a set of science and psychoanalytic science and neuroscience-based data points to help parents think about how to approach the screens. They're part of our life. We can't get rid of them. They're here to stay, and how to integrate them in our day-to-day existence is a set of principles that are very individual, and we all have to make our own decisions on how to deal with screens. So Dr. Messina and I will be talking about our ideas. They're not directions, but suggestions and framework for thinking about this particular topic.
Well, thank you, Harry. That's very interesting. I'm going to start talking about the very beginning of infancy, and as I said, from Erikson's perspective. And also, I want to add that Dr. Gill knows a great deal about psychodynamic and psychoanalytic thinking, so please chime in. So the first stage is trust versus mistrust. That starts in infancy, and during the first year of life, a baby needs to form a secure attachment. At least that's the ideal. That's what we want for our children. If he or she is plunked in front of a TV or given an iPad or other device to watch or listen to, a sense of trust really can't be established, because infants need to look at faces of their caregivers. They need to learn to be responsive and see responsiveness in their mothers, fathers, or whoever's taking care of them. That's how they learned to build trust. At least it's one way. Screens act as a barrier. There are lots of things that they miss out on. We say later that some screen time is okay, but not during infancy. Infants don't need to be exposed to screens. It happened during COVID quite a bit, and it's, I suppose, somewhat understandable, where two people were at home working, and they had an infant or young children or a child. It was a tendency for people to put them in front of something, a show, and do their work. But unfortunately, it didn't end there. A lot of things went awry, and a lot of kids are still behind because they were infants and young children during COVID. And what did schools do? They also did online teaching, and that was very disorienting for, say, kindergartners and first graders, because they hadn't been to school to speak of. Maybe first graders had, but it was a limited experience. And all of a sudden, they're in front of the TV on Zoom or some other platform. So getting back to infants, fast-paced programs can be overstimulating for developing brains. So they miss out on skills that lead to self-regulation and to attention. So it's a problem. It sets the stage for life if you don't develop trust as an infant.
One of the mechanisms that I think involves developing of trust in infants is a responsive and attuned parent. And oftentimes what we see are parents whose attention is being demanded by screens and various notifications and interruptions or work requirements. And these microscopic delays in which the parent is interacting with a screen while the child may be hungry or may need a diaper change, those microscopic, I would say, 2 minutes of delay is 2 minutes where an infant that is totally dependent on our care is experiencing anxiety and distress because they're hungry, which they experience as pain, or they're wet, which they experience as profound discomfort, and they're afraid of that state. And the parent innocently is distracted by a screen, but at the same time, there are costs to that mistrust stage of development, as you said, Karyne. And to amplify the point of engagement of an infant by a screen is not the same as engagement of an infant with a rattle, with a cube, with something that they can actually manipulate and begin to develop gross motor skills. Staring at a screen is consumption of information that is interesting and can be paralyzing. As you said, lots of active movement can actually be scary to an infant, and they can be mortified and just sit there staring, but we're not engaging them in gross motor development or even fine motor development later because they're not doing anything, which is possibly the way to think about the beginnings of brain rot. The brain does not develop the functions that it needs to be developing during that critical period of time.
As I've learned from you, there are programs that are way too overstimulated. So basically, putting an infant, as I said before, in front of a screen is not a good idea. There are some shows that are worse than others, and when all they see are flashing lights and colors and sounds, they can't make anything of that. An older child can perhaps process it somewhat, although there are some shows that are better than others. But an infant, there's no way. They just get overstimulated.
And as you say, they have no context for the stimulus because infant needs a parent to inform and create a sense of reality. The parent informs the child what it is that they're looking at and what is the meaning of that content. Because the infant and a young child is just beginning to develop infrastructure of understanding the world. So early on exposure is totally incomprehensible. And I agree with you that there's literally no reason that screens should be present in that first year of life.
Following up on that, tell us from a neurological standpoint, from a neuroscience standpoint, the neurological changes that occur in a child's brain when they're exposed to prolonged periods of screen time.
I think the most important point for people to understand is that the babies are born with minimal structure of the prefrontal cortex. So prefrontal cortex is sort of almost like a blank slate, if you will. Prefrontal cortex is that part of the brain that we use for the rest of our life to make decisions. We understand what we're looking at because of prefrontal cortex. We can look at different equiprobable answers and choose what's the right answer. And majority of wiring of prefrontal cortex occurs between 0 and 6 years of life. And there's an explosion of wiring and interconnectedness in that first period of life that essentially creates an environment or infrastructure on which we build the rest of our psychic life into adulthood. And as such, how those early years are screen exposure, family structure, developing trust versus mistrust, educational intervention, learning how to self-regulate. Those are critical aspects of development that then later in adolescence, kids I see as clients, we see the consequences of. The kids that cannot regulate themselves, the kids that need screens at all times, the kids that cannot tolerate silence, the kids that cannot tolerate being separate from their friends, the kids that have unrealistic expectations of life, unrealistic goals in life, because they've been exposed to normalcy of the screens that is not necessarily normal for their particular community or their particular life experience.
Yeah, very good points. So let me move on to Erikson's second stage of development, which occurs from 18 months to 3 years of age. And these are approximate windows. But it's called autonomy versus shame and doubt. And it's when a child starts to develop a sense of independence. It's hard to develop a sense of independence and exploration if you're in front of a screen, because you're not exploring, you're not crawling under the couch, you're probably not sucking on a blanket, you're probably not playing with a basket of toys, you're probably just riveted to whatever it is that you're watching or what the child is watching. And that's not good because it limits physical exploration, the development of gross and fine motor skills, spatial awareness, problem solving. Major problem solving takes place in this period with just putting puzzles together or working with some kind of appropriate toy for someone from 18 months to 3 years of age. If they're just watching the screen, none of that's going on. So problem solving isn't happening. So when toddlers spend excessive time in front of screens, they just miss out on a great deal. And it also reduces their decision-making opportunities. So this sense of independence isn't developing. It's not evolving. And it interferes with self-regulation. Our toddlers need to regulate their emotions and behaviors. But screens interfere with that.
You're absolutely accurate. What I want to emphasize is the distinction between acquiring and processing information versus developing a sense of agency and a sense of capacity. I was fascinated. I have a now about to be 8-year-old child, and it's fascinating to see the kind of computer games he's exposed to. And there was one that was fascinating, and he actually agreed with me that it's stupid. I'm going to use that word. That was called tower building. And effectively, he would hold his finger on the screen, and the computer was making a tower and building. There was nothing required of him except holding the finger on the screen. So he experienced unrealistic experience that this minimal activity creates all of this result, versus what I think is the beginning of frustration tolerance, which is incredibly important when a child is trying to build a tower of cubes and it falls down. and then they build it again, and then it falls down again. So we're both accomplishing fine motor skills development, but also frustration tolerance, because vast assistance that the computer can give in producing a complicated result. Drawing a picture on a computer screen is very easy. Drawing it in real life with colored pencils is not that easy. So those are the beginnings of sense of what I can and cannot do, and developing neural infrastructure to both have skills to accomplish a task, but also learn how to fail and be okay with failure and work towards doing things better.
No, and that reminds me of the first and youngest patient who I've worked with was 3 years old, and we did tower building, and we did some sort of train work. The child would have some kind of a block that would be a train, and the train would run into me invariably. And we talked about this child being angry and angry with me and angry with his parents, and so much came of that. If he had just been watching a screen all the time, I don't think much of anything would have come from it. And there wouldn't have been discussions, maybe he was 3.5, but there wouldn't have been discussions about anger for sure. And there wouldn't have been an opportunity for him to begin to learn about that.
Absolutely. In fact, in nearly all of the cases at Embark Behavioral Health, and actually take care of kids in Pennsylvania and DC and Georgia, so vast geographic area. And the problem is similar everywhere, which is that the kids cannot both understand, tolerate, and manage their feelings, and they use screens to avoid the feelings. So the screens are then used endlessly, which consumes enormous amounts of time, which then affects their academic performance, their social life. But when they turn off the screen, because parents start screaming at them, turn off the screen, all of those feelings are still there, and they have no skills to manage those feelings. Because there was no time or space to learn how to deal with aggression, how to deal with frustration, how to deal with rejection of love, all sorts of things. Screen doesn't provide any of that. It's just a stimulus.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So moving to another neuroscience question, or looking at this from a neuroscience perspective, tell us about how screen time alters the development of the prefrontal cortex as it relates to executive functioning. You might want to define executive functioning.
Executive functioning is sort of set up. I'm going to speak extemporaneously, not necessarily a book definition. All aspects of our daily capacity to organize ourselves, a sense of time, sense of space, ability to organize tasks in a fashion that is effective and accomplishes tasks. So how does screen time affect our executive functioning? Very similar to everything I said so far. Consumption of data doesn't really teach anything. And in fact, most of the kids that I see have a very dramatic loss of sense of time. They don't have experience of what 5 minutes means, what 1 hour means, what 24 hours in a day means, what nighttime versus morning means, because screens have now blurred that experience. And it is very interesting to have a 13, 14, or 21-year-old that has to learn what time actually represents. And dramatically, while there are external structures in place, like grade school, middle school, high school, where the problems begin, and there are external timers and structures, and kids do relatively okay. Once they go to college and they now have to really internally organize themselves, they really begin to implode because their executive functioning is incredibly challenged. And we live in a world where screen gets you food, screen gets you love, screen gets you sexual pleasures. So there is no need to develop the executive function to obtain something. And so once the budget is spent on Chipotle or a pizza or whatever Uber Eats will deliver, most of the clients that I see are unable to do basic food budgeting, planning, food preparation, let alone taking care of their own sort of day-to-day functioning. And all of that starts very, very early. But this is why those 0 to 6 years, where prefrontal cortex, where all of the networking that conceives of time, conceives of space, and makes decision how we're going to spend time, that's where the foundation is created. After that, the child enters a period of latency, which we'll get into, from about 7 to 11 when puberty starts. And when puberty starts, the brain again has a burst of development of networking, where we have an opportunity to intervene. And this is why I'm so fond of programs like Embark, because it's an early intervention at the time where the brain's still rewiring. And we can teach kids some of these skills and how to self-regulate and how to deal with screens ultimately. And if I may say, one of the reasons for thinking of writing this book with Karyne was that kids find it interesting when I explain to them how screens are actually exhausting, how information processing is not entertaining. It is mildly pleasurable, but is also very tiring. And they're the ones that, with education about what screens are doing with that, with their brain, they're able to modify their relationship with screens once they understand it, versus if we just tell them, you can't use your screen, because it's a source of pleasure for them.
Well, that's a very good point. And I think that explaining why a child can't do something or the effects of something is very important at any age, even before they can talk. Babies can understand what's going on, so it's important to talk about what you're doing. For example, mommy's or daddy's putting on your sweater now, and then we're going to go out, and then we're going to go in the snow. I guess I would be thinking of that since it's just snowed in Washington, D.C. And now we're going to do this, and later when we come home, we'll do X. So it's important to talk to kids at all ages. It's important to talk with each other at all ages.
It speaks to the relevance of, which we'll expand on, the adult, the parent engagement with screens, because if you look around you, you will see parents that are staring at the screens because they are mesmerized by the screen and they don't have time to talk the child through all the steps that you just described. And in fact, if the parent is staring at a screen, they are prone to have exaggerated reactions of irritability and impatience with the child that may innocently ask a question that should be answered calmly and lovingly.
So maybe we have time for each of us to talk about one more point and then, or stage of development, and then we'll go on from there next time. So I'll go back to Erikson's third stage of development, which is initiative versus guilt, which occurs approximately from 3 to 5. And this is a time when children develop purpose and direction. And that's hard to believe for some people. Like my 3-year-old is developing a sense of purpose. But actually, it actually does start there because they assert power and control over their world. They could begin to do it during those 2 years. So through directing play and other social activities, this occurs. During this stage, children develop a sense of purpose and the ability to set goals and follow through with plans. This is if they haven't been bombarded with too much screen time. Overuse of screens during this period can significantly impact a child's development and purpose in several ways. It limits imaginative play. Screen time often replaces imaginative, self-directed play or play with another child, which is reduced social interaction. If they're just looking at a screen, they're not playing with a friend. It's passive versus active engagement. So that's another big problem. There's instant gratification. It's hard for children to develop the patience and persistence needed for long-term goal setting and achievement. It reminds me of what you said about your son in the tower. If you're just watching a tower being built, that's not doing very much in terms of his ability to learn to be patient and persistent in order to achieve a long-term goal, such as building this tower. So it limits a lot of things, physical activity, it narrows interests, reduces autonomy, and there's an impact on executive functions.
From neuroscience perspective, this is the critical period of language development, interaction, communication, both expressive and receptive language development. And here's in particular what you mentioned before, we have to be vigilant on what are the children exposed to on the screens. Oftentimes, they are exposed to things that they want to see, which is oftentimes just like watching candy. Lots of color, lots of screeching, lots of noise, highly stimulating, highly exciting, but very, very non-informative. And we can curate what kids see and have them watch things that are clearly audible, understandable, age appropriate, and offer them some experience of learning. During this period, not to put a plug for PBS Kids, but there's variety of programming. Some of it, if you really pay attention, even adults cannot understand what the characters are saying, because there's a little squeaky voices that have almost no enunciation of the words, and that's what kids are exposed to, versus shows in which the characters are very clearly speaking to concepts where kids can learn problem solving and also teamwork, interaction with other kids, and exposing them to some kind of programming at that stage is not a terrible idea, but it does need to be curated with thought to how does this promote my child's development versus how much is this just brain candy that'll produce brain rot, just like candy will produce teeth rot.
I have watched more Paw Patrol based on your advice than you can imagine. So I know a lot about that after watching it with my 5-year-old granddaughter, who goes to that every time. She doesn't want to watch any zowie kind of flashing light things. It's Paw Patrol every time. So
I'm sorry.
I'm quite familiar with it. It's actually cute. One last question, Harry. This is really important, as you know, and will definitely recognize. What is the effect of excessive screen time on the brain's reward system, and particularly relationship to dopamine release?
Being exposed to screens and having ability to select the pleasurable material, whatever that may be, age related, does produce secretion of dopamine, and it creates pleasure reinforcement, in which, like any other pleasurable activity, there is internally reinforcing system. So kids develop addiction very, very early on. And I think most parents can identify with a situation where you're trying to pry the screen out of their hands and they're throwing a tantrum, they're throwing objects, they're screaming at you. And worst case scenarios, they end up with our program where they actually physically attacked a parent all over the screen. And teaching the child and putting screen in the context that screen is not important, that it is something for entertainment, maybe moderately learning experience, but that is something that can be put down at any point in time, is incredibly important. And only we as parents and adults can inform children, because the screen itself is going to self-perpetuate and want kids engaged and want kids to see that next app, the next commercial, the next something that the machine wants them. The way our world is set up, the screen wants us to never get our eyes off of it. So it is really upon us to get our eyes off the screen and to help our children get their eyes off the screen. And that requires us to get off our screens so we can pay attention to our children's screens and help them, guide them.